Alexandria Ocasio Cortez is calling for Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, to be impeached for the lavish trips and gifts he's been accepting from his billionaire buddy without disclosing that information. And there are laws that got implemented after Watergate that say justices, judges, members of Congress as well are subject to these rules. Laws should disclose gifts that they're getting so that they're not being influenced in ways such as lavish trips like Clarence Thomas is now known to be getting. Hundreds of thousands of dollars spent by this billionaire, GOP mega billionaire, on Clarence Thomas's behalf, and he didn't disclose that information. Here is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez calling for this, saying she will introduce articles of impeachment, or hopefully another Democrat will as well, that she'll sign on to. And then we'll look at another moment from her in just a second.
You know, so to get to the heart of your question, Congress is out of session for the next week. So that does give Democrats sometimes some time to strategize. And the way I feel about it is that I do think articles need to be introduced. If we decide strategically that the actual author of those articles and who introduces them may not be me, that's fine. I will support impeachment. But I just think that if no one's going to introduce it, I would certainly be open to doing so and drafting them myself. I think this is gone far, far beyond any sort of acceptable standard in any democracy, let alone an American democracy.
There we go. And then this is her appearance on State of the Union with Dana Bash, where she speaks more to this and specifically responds to the statement response by Clarence Thomas to the ProPublica reporting on this.
More about the Supreme Court and what you mentioned before, which is that Justice Clarence Thomas, you want him to be impeached after a new ProPublica report this week revealed that he accepted luxury vacations from a Republican billionaire donor without disclosing them. Thomas is now defending himself, and here's what he's saying. He's saying, quote, "Early in my tenure at the court, I sought guidance from my colleagues and others in the judiciary and was advised that this sort of personal hospitality from close personal friends who did not have business before the court was not reportable, rather." What is your response?
I think that his own statement contradicts many of the facts on the ground and also raises in other ways even more serious questions. Later on in his statement, he stated that the reason and the rationale for this exemption was personal hospitality from an old friend. And he said himself in his statement, a friend of 25 years. Justice Thomas has been on the court for 30 years. And so to say what he is admitting in his statement in an attempt to defend himself is that he began this relationship with a billionaire and receiving these sorts of gifts after he was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. I think that in and of itself indicates a very, very serious problem. And then on top of that, he is now implicating his colleagues. And I do believe that Chief Justice John Roberts must now come forward and state if he allows and is allowing this kind of very serious corruption to happen on this court.
Right. Yeah, so even if you're a defender of Clarence Thomas, you gotta understand how this looks. Come on. He has this position of power that directly impacts so many different areas of life, different industries, different interests. And then he has this friend who is involved in a lot of those very interests and surrounds him with other people who have very particular interests in regard to business and the rulings of the Supreme Court. And then he's showering you with all of this money worth of gifts and trips, and you're not disclosing that. Of course, that's going to decrease the perceived legitimacy of the Supreme Court and you in particular as a Supreme Court justice. And that could absolutely blur your vision when making some of these decisions or mess with your ability to be impartial. And Clarence Thomas knew how it looked, clearly, because he wasn't disclosing those things, which could have been a violation of the law. Lastly, this just kind of came out in regard to this sort of, it's just strange. The mega donor billionaire, mega GOP donor billionaire, Harlan Crow, apparently has a bunch of Nazi historical artifacts, I guess. Take a look at this. When Republican mega donor Harlan Crow isn't lavishing Justice Clarence Thomas with free trips on his private plane and yacht, he lives a quiet life in Dallas among his historical collections. These collections include Hitler artifacts, 2 of his paintings of European cityscapes, and a signed copy of Mein Kampf, and assorted Nazi memorabilia, plus a garden full of statues of the 20th century's worst despots. Quote, "I can't get over the collection of Nazi memorabilia," says one person who attended an event at Crow's home a few years ago and asked to remain anonymous. It would have been helpful to have someone explain the significance of all the items. Without that context, you sort of just gasp when you walk into the room. Yeah. And apparently he says he keeps these mementos because he hates communism and fascism, which in museums, there's Nazi stuff. So I get that you can have artifacts that you're not celebrating, but it's just a strange addition to this story, for sure.